Cam, we're celebrating GoldenEye at the moment, and we have quite the man joining us to help us dive into its depths and some other wonderful spy movies too. Joining us on the show now, he is a second unit director, he's an assistant director, he's a producer, he is the one and only Mr. Richard Whelan. Hello, sir, how are you?
Very good. What an introduction. Wasn't quite
Uh,
prepared for that. Fantastic. Thank you.
I just throw people into the deep end, but there'll be some more questions like that to come, so look out for that.
Uh, now
Um,
I'm ready.
I'm not for the last question. You're not, and I will not let you be ready for it.
Okay,
But we'll
cool.
we'll come round for that. We'll come round to that. Now, I want to chart the course of GoldenEye because it's having its 30th anniversary at the moment. It's just gone back in theaters for a weekend. It's getting a lot of love, and it should get that love, I think. But before we get to your work on GoldenEye, I want to get into the story of how you got into this wonderful industry in the first place. So, what made you want to get into the film industry?
Well, how long is the podcast?
Long as you want.
So very simply, I wanted to be a lawyer from when I was a teenager, and so I studied law, went to university, got to university, and sat in a lecture in I think probably like the second month I'd been in the university, and listened to a lecturer talk about criminal law, which is what I wanted to do. And it was that kind of horrendous realization where I realized that if I wanted to be a lawyer, I had to disconnect emotively from anything to do with every case that I worked on and just do the job by the book. And it was a horrendous realization that I thought, well, this is just not who I am as a person, and I don't think I can go through a career where I'm emotionally detached from my work. So I thought about it a lot, and then got drunk a lot, went to a lot of parties, had a great time. Doing absolutely no work because I sort of had this kind of crisis of conscience about becoming a lawyer. And then I think I turned up at my first mock exam still drunk from the night before. And then the second mock exam, I didn't turn up at all. And then the principal called me into his office and said, "You're not really taking this seriously, Richard, are you?" And I said, "No, I'm not actually." And he said, "So, like, I think you probably should leave." And I said, "Absolutely, I'm going to leave. Thanks very much. I'm out of here." Went home and that classic, sort of. I guess I was just 18 at the time, and my parents said to me, "So, okay, so how's it all going?" I said, "Well, actually, I've left." And they said, "Okay, so what are you going to do?" And I said, "Well, I have absolutely no idea." So my father was wise enough to say, "Okay, well, let's think about what you enjoy." And I said, "Well, I enjoy playing football." He said, "Well, that's never going to be a profession." And I said, "I enjoy going to the cinema." And he said, "Well, why don't you try and get into film?" And I went, "Okay, great." And so I spent 6 months touring around every studio in the UK. And at that point, it was a different kind of security system, unlike the Marvel security system now, where you need kind of biometrics and blood results to get into the studio. Now, used to be able to wave to the studio security, smile, and they just thought you knew where you were going. So got into all the studios, took a CV around, spent 6 months trying to do it, walked into an office one day. There was a lady unpacking boxes in an office at Pinewood Studios. And I said, "Look, I don't know what I'm doing. I'm just desperate to try and find a way into the industry. Is there anything I can do to help? I'll work for free." And she said, "Well, actually, my existing runner or PA has just moved up to become a third AD, and I'm looking for someone. I'll put you on 2 weeks trial and see how you get on." And by pure luck for me, that was Jim Cameron's Aliens, and
Yeah.
I did my 2 weeks trial and ended up on the movie for 11 months. And then by the time I got to the end, I was being jumping out of APCs for inserts with boots with just like Jim Cameron, Adrian Biddle, and myself. I was wearing every costume there was to do like acid burns on this chest of Michael Bean of inserts, and so I had the bug. So yeah, so that was my launch into the business, and from that point on, I was incredibly lucky.
How did the working on the set of Alien, that's your first, working experience compared to the stuff that would come after? Because, I've seen documentaries about aliens and there's been talk about how it was kind of a difficult shoot. Did it feel that way, or was it like this is an adventure and, similar shoots happened as you continued on?
Well, I think at the time I didn't realize, but what was really interesting is that at the time in the industry in the UK, we were so Aliens was the last sort of four wall movie that was made at Pinewood, whereby Pinewood didn't not only sort of service the movie, but all of the departments within the studio also had to work on the film. So you had to have the Pinewood prop team, you had to have the Pinewood construction team, you had to have the Pinewood lighting team. And these were all people that had been in the studio. You know, they were all, should I say, senior members of the studio. They'd been there forever. They'd sort of got the, been there. They'd done every movie in the last sort of 30 years there. And you had Jim Cameron, who was a really sort of, I guess, a new maverick sort of type of director that was really sort of I guess, the beginnings of that kind of, I suppose not the beginnings, but I guess he was in that sort of mid 80s where we were very unionized in the UK. He sort of blew that apart and just said, I want the best people. I don't care where they come from. And so we had this really interesting mix. And at the time, I didn't realize, but when I look back, it was really interesting of real old school, old time, like the gaffer was a guy called Jack Thetford, who was, I think he was like, must have been 64 when we shot the movie, just about to retire. You had him working with Adrian Biddle, who at the time was like a hot new commercials director. I mean, before that, the funny story is just very quickly, and I'll shut up, but just so I came onto the movie, I didn't know anything about it. I just did all the photocopying and all the stuff that you do as a PA. And there was a lovely director of photography that came on who was kind of like he was a big name at Disney at the time called Dick Bush, and Dick started the movie. And I just remember vividly taking all this stuff in because I was new to it. And Dick, I became very friendly with. He was prepping the movie, he was pre-lighting all the sets. And on day one of principal photography, Jim walked in onto the stage. And I think I was walking on with teas and coffees for people. And and Jim said it was like 8 o'clock in the morning. Dick was there with all the crew. And so Jim said, okay, great. So Dick, we're going to have the first shot. It's going to be like Sigourney running down, like, when do you reckon we can turn over? And he said, well, probably tomorrow, maybe Wednesday. And Jim was like, I'm sorry. And he sort of laughed and he went, no. Like, when can I turn over? He said, well, I don't think I'm going to be ready today. So, let's talk later this afternoon. And that, of course, that was Dick's last day. So he kind of like carried on lighting on that Monday, and they fired him Monday night. And Adrian came in and took over on Tuesday morning, and they turned over at like 8:30 in the morning. And it was a real shift in the industry where those sort of titans had to either step up or get off the train. And it was a really interesting, and I think so it was that, and it was at the time in the UK industry, we were all incredibly successful as a business. It was kind of like the mid 2000s with Harry Potter now, is that there was so much work, and the industry was such a small industry that I think the UK teams thought they could do no wrong and they'd never fail. So their union requirements became so difficult and so expensive. Everyone was being paid for an 8-hour day, 40-hour week. So people were making enormous amounts of money then. And really, it was that point whereby, when Margaret Thatcher sort of said, okay, there is no closed shop unions, everyone can join. She blew the unions up. It sort of blew the business up for us, and producers suddenly realized they didn't have to hire union people. The industry shifted dramatically and everything changed then. So that movie was a real pivotal shift in sort of unionized UK to non-union, everyone just out to get a job, and it was the best person that won, as opposed to if you had a union ticket, you would get a job regardless. So I guess that was the really interesting part of it, and that's what I think I took from that more than anything. They tried to fire Jim tried to fire the first AD, and I remember vividly being on the set, and all the crew just said, if you fire him, we're all leaving, and the whole crew left for the day. And I remember, because I ended up sort of being Jim's PA, which didn't really exist at the time, but he had so much going on. He was designing all the sets, he was designing the weapons, he was directing the movie, he was doing everything. And so I just got to listen to him and Gail having various meetings where it was like they were desperate to get rid of the UK crew. They hated them. I hated the thing that you had to stop for tea for 15 minutes at 10 o'clock. And so it was that real sort of shift, I think, for the UK industry. So it was really interesting to have observed that. And then literally after that, the Pinewood Studio sort of, their departmental structure fell apart and everyone became freelance and the movie industry shifted quite dramatically at that point.
Wow. Like what?
Sorry,
Talk about
very, very
being...
long answer to a short question.
No,
I
no.
think like these are the invaluable stories that people who work in the industry can tell. Like I'm sure we can dive into GoldenEye in a minute, but you were there in and around a pivotal moment in British film history, as you pointing out. I'm sure there. I mean, if you have more to tell us, I want to hear more about it. I feel it's more of a shame that I'm in the wrong industry because I don't get regulated 10 o'clock breaks for tea. I wish I did.
Don't we all? Exactly. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. No, it became a running joke through the whole film. Jim was so frustrated by it, and I know it was the same on Star Wars, which was obviously earlier, but it was that was the same thing with George Lucas when George. I eventually did Attack of the Clones with George some years later, and we were laughing because his first AD was a guy called Tony Way, who was also our line producer on GoldenEye, and I remember him saying, "Yeah, I just couldn't figure out Tony Way. Like every morning, like we'd 10 o'clock, he'd break the crew for tea, and I had so much to do. And then at 4 o'clock, he'd break the crew for tea again. And he said, and then he had an hour for lunch, and it's an 8 hour day. He said, like I just couldn't get anything done, and it was like it was such a clash of cultures at the time, and it was sort of, and that's what I saw the back end of in sort of the mid-80s. So it's quite interesting.
Yeah, and I don't think James Cameron ever went back and shot a movie in the UK
I
again.
don't think so. I think he hated everything about that experience. It was really interesting because it was just a very different, he was, it wasn't that he was a maverick. He had a very determined view of how he wanted to make his movie, and he couldn't understand why he had to fit into a box of how everybody else worked when he was the director. And it was, and he's obviously ever since he's forged his own path, and that's why he's the success that he is. So yeah, it's a really fascinating time in history, I think, for the business.
Being around for that sort of change and it being sort of your inaugural entry point in a sense, it's your first, dipping your toe into the waters, as it were. Do you feel like it shaped you a little bit towards the thought processes of before that change or after that change? Like, what did you take from that lesson?
I think initially, what was interesting is that from that point to the time that I, in quotes, got my union ticket,
Hmm.
those changes were happening, and it was. So I guess one could look back on it, sort of, I guess, slightly bitter if you wanted to. Although, because I guess I've been had such a lucky career, I wouldn't. But I did 300 days as a runner. It took me over 2.5 years to do it. I got my union ticket. I had to stand in front of a board of assistant directors and pitch why they should let me in the union. And literally 2 days after I got in the union, I thought my career was made. Margaret Thatcher took all of those rights away, and anyone could join the union who wanted to. So at the time, I was like, "Wow, have I picked the wrong industry? Is this going to fall apart?" And then I had no choice because I had no other skills. So I just thought, okay, I'm going to stick at this and see if I can still make it work. And it was very different. We all worked on movies where we got paid absolutely very little. I mean, I'll give you an example. Obviously, I went from Aliens to a movie called With Nail and I, which was a
Yeah.
Handmade Films film, also as the office runner. And on Aliens, I remember just in terms of the difference in financials is that I was probably taking home, which is a long time ago, £400 a week because of the overtime I was making, and
Hmm.
and then I went on to With Nail and I, which is an independent small movie, and because unions had all stopped, I was making £100 a week for all the hours I could possibly do, and I was working for somebody who was a legendary tyrant at the time. She'd actually injured. I think she'd actually put a previous PA in hospital before me
Oh
by
my God.
throwing a stapler at him and throwing a stapler at him and hitting him in the head and splitting his head open. Um, And so she was so like, I did ridiculous hours, but you just did whatever you took, whatever you did. That was the attitude. You just worked and you did whatever you were told whenever you were told, and you just got on with it. And it was but that was the big shift. And suddenly I went, thinking like I was, a playboy earning a fortune to, and I'd say I was only just 18. So to suddenly like, wow, I've really got to like, pull my bootstraps up, and I'm going to be really careful about, because I'm barely earning any money, and I'm driving to work every day and not getting paid petrol. And so it was a radical shift in the industry that it was interesting to be part of. And I think in a way I'm sort of grateful to look back on it, because we've kind of gone full circle. And I think we're at a point now where I sort of send out a warning to all of those in the UK who are now pushing hard to shift kind of union regulations to be more aggressive and more protective for the workers, is because I just said everyone's got to be careful, because we'll price ourselves out, and very quickly the industry will leave the UK if we become so expensive that we're not really employable anymore. So, I think the message to anybody who's listening to these podcasts who wants to be part of the business is that you just have to be smart about the fact that ultimately it's a business, and the business will go wherever the tax incentives are, and will go where the cheapest place is to make the movie. And if the UK becomes too expensive, that will cease very quickly. And so we all have to be smart about that. And I see both sides of the coin. I've been an employee and I'm an employer, so I kind of see it from both sides. And I think we all do very nicely. We all earn a great living, and we just need to be cautious about it.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, you look at what's happening in LA. Films don't shoot there anymore. Like the industry's basically abandoning the area. They're moving to, other parts of Europe or Georgia or
every
Canada.
other state, but yeah.
It's interesting times. But let's start this journey then towards GoldenEye, because you spoke about Aliens. You with Nail and I was next, and then you're working. I think you do another film or two as a production brand. The Witches is what I saw on there.
I did, yeah.
And then you've got a few where you step into the third AD role, or sometimes assistant director, making your way to GoldenEye. But when did that transition happen, going into the AD role?
I mean, basically, what I guess what's kind of relevant to this podcast is that I got asked to do a small movie called A Hazard of Hearts as a floor runner, and I got asked to do that because the second AD had phoned us bizarrely, because there was no mobile phones at the time, had phoned our office when I was working on Aliens, trying to get hold of a special effects team in the studio. I'd answered the phone, and the second AD had said, "Look, I'm trying to get a message through to the special effects team." And I said, "Look, why don't you give me the message? I'll run over to the special effects department, give them the message, and call back in 10 minutes, and I'll tell you that I've got the message to them." Anyway, did that. Anyway, cut to a couple of years later, I get a call from this second AD saying, "Look, I remember you helped me out on, when I was trying to get a message. I'm looking for a floor runner on this little tiny movie. Do you want to come and meet me?" So I went and met him, and the second AD was a guy called Callum McDougall, and Callum's done 11 Bonds now. And he was the second AD on that film. It's called A Hazard of Hearts. It was a Barbara Cartland sort of romantic novel. And we did that movie together, and then we became very close friends. And I suppose flashing forward, then Callum and I worked together a lot. We became good friends. He ended up being the best man at my wedding. And we've been friends ever since for 35 years plus. So obviously we worked on GoldenEye together. And yeah, we've been friends ever since. And our paths, I guess, oddly, professionally, haven't crossed as much as we hoped they would. But as I say, we did that. We did this little tiny movie called Hazard of Hearts. We did another one, same company years later, where I was the third, he was the second. And then I guess we just grew up in the business together. And I suppose to round off that is that Callum and I have now got a company together. And I know you mentioned Scott the Professionals, but we're both, basically developing the professionals together within our company. So yeah, so it's all connected.
Well, there you go. That's the beginning of the foot in the door by the sounds of it. I was just checking Callum's IMDb, and I note he worked on Condor Man, which is a firm favorite on this
He
podcast.
did.
So I feel like we will have to tap him up in the future to have a
Yeah.
conversation.
We
I have,
constant joke about the classics on our CVs. Condor Man, Very Like a Whale, I think was another one, and
yeah.
he did Rising Damp the movie, which was
Mm-hmm.
also yeah. So yeah, there's
Mm.
some classics there.
Okay, well, all right. Then we might have booked a future interview just for here, but we'll stick to what we've got now. So that connection there, because I was looking at the timeline there you just sort of spelled out with I'm just trying to find the name of the film again that you were just working on. It's
What, The
gone from
Witches or
no, sorry. Oh, Hazard of Hearts, that's the one.
Heads
And
of
then
Hearts? Yeah, yeah.
and then Callum does License to Kill a couple of years later in '89, and then there's a few years, and obviously GoldenEye comes along. So is that the beginning of your GoldenEye story? Is your connection with Callum?
Oddly, it wasn't. It was actually with Terry Madden, who was the second unit first AD.
Hmm.
I had met Terry, been recommended to him. I can't remember from who now, and I ended up being Terry's second on a TV series, a dreadful TV series called Thief Takers. We did that. I then went on to work with him on. Uh, I'm trying to think. I'm sure that was the way round. Yeah, I then went. I did First Night with him as his second, and then he was already part of the Bond family, having done a number of Bonds already. And then he then went on to do GoldenEye. I was already seconding for him, and that's how I then did GoldenEye with him. So he took me onto that from First Night.
Okay.
And I mean, aside from the GoldenEye story, where are you as a Bond fan? Was it a series of films you particularly enjoyed, had watched before, or were you sort of agnostic to it?
And I know, huge fan. I mean, it was like for me to go and do a Bond movie was a massive, enormous privilege, and to have said that I've been able to work on one will always stay as an enormous privilege to me. I think the stories of a first AD that I worked for years before called Nick Hextall Smith. Nick had been a runner for Cubby on I think I'm trying to think. I think it was trying to think which one it was actually. It might have been Live and Let Die, but and he always spoke so fondly of Cubby, and then we worked together, and so and then I just always had my eye on thinking that was an amazing goal. I worked for Derek Cracknell, who I think was the first AD on Live and Let Die. I did a few movies with Derek. Derek obviously was the first AD on Aliens, so I met him on that, and then I sort of kept in touch with him. Then I thirded for him, and then we often exchange stories about that movie because I think that's my all time favorite Bond film. And so yeah, I'd always been a huge fan of that franchise. I never really thought I was going to get a chance to work on one. It was just really the stars aligned, and I was very fortunate to be able to be asked to do it. And it was an extraordinary journey and a great privilege. And look, it was a tough film because it was Martin was reinventing the franchise. It was a new Bond. They hadn't made one for some time, and there was all eyes were on whether the Broccolis were going to be able to pull it off with a new Bond and reinvent the franchise. So, yeah, it was very pressured. There was a lot of new faces because obviously the Broccoli family, they had a very tight group of heads
Mhm.
of department that they always worked with. They very much threw the net out and worked with some very new people on this particular Bond. And at the same time, I think not dissimilar to really Jim on Aliens is that when Martin came in, Martin was quite a sort of maverick director at the time. Um, Martin really shook it up as well. He brought in people that hadn't worked on a Bond before to work with him, especially on the unit I did on the second unit. Ian Sharp wasn't part of that group. Harvey Harrison, who was the DP on the second unit, wasn't part of the Bond family. And before that, they'd always had Arthur Worcester had done all the second units at that point, and so Martin really sort of shook it up, and I think for the good, truthfully. But I think at the time it was a bumpy ride just because it was a bit of a clash of cultures of these sort of new, like Ian was much more of a commercials kind of independent filmmaker as a second unit director. And so he was quite maverick. Harvey was very much Ian's guy. And so uh, and Terry Madden was kind of really very much broccoli in a part of the broccoli family. So there was a bit of a clash there. So it was a bit of a them and us when we first started. Um, and Martin worked at a very different pace to I think what Bonds have been used to. I know Martin now. Interestingly, he's attached to direct the professionals, so I speak to him a lot on a regular basis, and but he even now in his I think he's 81 now. His speed and energy of working was very different to what those Bond movies were used to. I mean, even now, and he did then, is that Martin would arrive on the set every morning at 5 a.m. He would spend 3 hours planning his day shooting. And then, so as soon as the crew arrived at 8 o'clock, it was literally like firing a starting pistol. Like he was ready to go. He wanted to get the day done. And everyone just literally was full on until the moment he wrapped, and he wrapped on time every day. So he was incredibly disciplined in terms of the way he wants to make the movie. And so that was a really interesting experience. So it shifted the tone of how Bonds were made from when Martin came on board, which was really interesting. Barbara, loved him, and they all got on brilliantly. And of course, it was such a huge success that he then reinvented the Bond again, years later in Casino Royale. So, yeah, I think it was a really poignant Bond movie at that moment, I think. And I think Martin was the absolute perfect director to do it.
Now, you have a credit on the film as additional assistant director. And I was curious, were you there the duration of the shoot, or were you just select scenes, or how did your job work within GoldenEye?
So I was the second AD on the second unit,
Mm-hmm.
and we shot, I think, nearly the entire movie. So I can't remember exactly how many days we did, but I think we shot for like at least 60 days of the film. So because we basically went to all of the countries, whereas the main unit didn't tend to do that. So the main unit came to Puerto Rico for a week. We spent 3 weeks in Puerto Rico. We did the dam jump in Switzerland. Main unit didn't go there at all. We spent 5 weeks in France doing all the car chase. The main unit came and did 2 days there with the actors in the cars. So we did, and we spent. I think we shot for like 6 weeks in Russia for the tank chase.
Wow.
So we did most of the locations, and then the main unit predominantly was studio based, and plus some London locations. So because we built a chunk of the Russian streets on the backlot, which was because we were the very first company to go into what is now Leavesden Studios.
Mm-hmm.
So it was still a broken down aircraft factory when we moved in, and it was a complete mess. I mean, we had to take our computers home with us in the evenings if it rained because all the roofs leaked and the offices got soaked. So Leavesden was literally, excuse my language, a total shithole at the time. So, but it still had the runway. It had more acreage there. And obviously now it's just it's a fabulous studio, but it doesn't have quite such the open space we had. So we built all of the miniatures got built out there, and we built a miniature set for the helicopter, for the Tiger helicopter explosion. We built an entire Russian street on the runway there. We used the runway for the plane going off the cliff, and that was a glass map. There was a glass painting, the big wide shots of a glass painting that Derek Meddings painted. So yeah, so Leavesden was really the home for most of the time for the main unit, and the second unit we did all the locations.
Wow. And GoldenEye is famous for pretty much having a unassailable collection of set pieces. And it's just
Yeah.
the next, each one is better than the next. Which was the one from, your vantage point behind the camera was the most difficult to put together?
I think there was probably, I guess there were sort of two which were kind of neck and neck for slightly different reasons. I think the tank chase, and I think the most incredible thing that we did, oddly, was the dam jump, just because it really was one. Well, I mean, the story, which I think is fantastic, is this. So we went out to the dam, and so Simon basically built a weight bag that was double the weight of Wayne, just to be sure that this bungee rope could take his weight. So we placed all the cameras. I think we had about 10 cameras placed all around the whole of the dam, and we used pushing the bag off as a rehearsal for all the camera teams to follow. Anyway, cut a long story short, we pushed the bag off after obviously lots of safety briefings and everything. The bag plummets, all the cameras follow it, and it gets to the strain point, and the rope snaps, and the bag plummets to the ground. We're now the day before shooting, so we get on the phone to Barbara and Michael, and Tom Pevsner, our line producer at the time, and we explain what's happened, and they say, "Well, okay, well, what is the solution?" So Simon said, "Well, look, there's one company out in wherever they were, somewhere in the US. They say they have this particular bungee rope that will do it, but in order to get it here, there's no commercial flight that'll get it here on time." So Barbara said, "Look, I'll send my jet." So she sends her jet to pick up this bungee, flies it overnight, gets it to us, and then we're presented with the fact that we've got this one window to shoot the jump. And it's like, well, we need to test the rope. And it's like, well, look, we know it's 10 times the braking strain of the other one. We know we've limited time. Let's talk to Wayne and see if he's prepared to do it. So we talked to Wayne. He said, look, I know what the rope is. I know this is definitely the braking strain that works. Okay, let's just go for it. So Wayne did the jump, having seen the day before that the bungee rope that we've been told was the right rope, was the rope that would take his weight. And I've never seen a man, and God bless him, but because he obviously did it and he did it beautifully, so terrified to do a stunt, I think, before that or since, because it really was truly kind of like his life in his hands. And what was amazing is that he went 880 feet down, but he went 375 feet back up, and he had the intelligence to put the gun back in his holster on the way up, and then pull the gun again to give everyone a second take on the way down. And I think that was just because it was the most terrifying, because it really was life and death at that point. That was probably the most dramatic of all of the things that we did.
What was it like to witness it?
It was extraordinary, really, because of course, as an assistant director, all you're doing is you're making sure all the ambulance crews are there, and that there's a quick escape. We had because of where we were shooting, we had to have an air ambulance with us, for the day of getting. So we had to get him out. And you've got 10 cameras, you've got 10 camera crews, you're shooting on film. So really, you're so involved in the complexity of the logistics that you're just sort of getting on with it. But I just remember vividly when we turned over, like Wayne's face, like literally was blue white, I think, with terror. But he just knew he had to go through with it. So yeah, I think it was, and I don't think I've done anything since where I felt that the stunt person was at greater risk than that, because we'd had what had happened beforehand, and Simon is the safest stunt coordinator. He's a great friend of mine now, and I literally saw him last week, and his attention to safety on everything he did. He did Titanic with over 150 stunt people a day, and and his attention to safety and his design skills and his support for his team is the best in the world, I think. And so he'd done everything there was to do to make sure that it was as safe a jump as possible. And of course, they'd done multiple tests at much lower levels and all of those things. So but it was just everything just built to this one moment. We're like, this is the only opportunity we've got to do this. Otherwise, we're pushing, 5 months or whatever. So it was, yeah, I think that was probably the most exhilarating, terrifying, and awe-inspiring to watch, I think.
Wow.
It's a very Bond thing in a way. Like going back to before the jump itself, the fact that they say, "Oh, we'll use our private jet to get this cable from North America over to where you're shooting it," like that's just big because these productions are. But the fact that Wayne took his life into his hands in that moment because he trusted the cable, and you have to as a diver or a climber or anything like that. So I get it, but that it's big. It's life or death, even though that's what James Bond is doing on the screen behind the camera. That was also happening. I didn't know that story. I don't know if people had heard that story before. Next time I see that jump, which I'm sure will be in the next few months, I'll just be like, oh, that guy could have been easily pulverized into nothing.
Yeah, yeah. And the final part of it that was, looking back on it, was always an interesting story, is that when we were finding all the camera positions at the base of the dam, and if you Google it, you can see it because it's apparently quite legendary, is a tiny little concrete entrance into where you get into the base, where there's certain controls of the dam and structures of the dam. So it's a little tiny, like a hut with a concrete roof on it. And we were going down looking for camera positions, and I remember one of the team looking over saying, like, "What's all those shards in the roof of the concrete roof?" And they said, "Oh, that's bone." And we said, what do you mean that's bone? And it was bone from previous suicides where someone had landed on the roof, and the impact was so enormous that they'd driven the bone into the concrete. And it kind of, okay, so. But yeah, so there was just so many stories like that. Yeah,
No
crazy.
bad mojo here.
No, exactly. Yeah, yeah. I don't think we told Wayne that. I don't think that we kept that quiet. I think. Yeah, yeah,
For the best, for the
yeah.
best.
Extraordinary time. Yeah, I think so. Yeah.
Well, let's. I want to get into more stories like that, things that will come to your mind, and as we talk about the film. But you talked about like being a fan of the Bond films. You're stepping onto this set for the first time. Do you remember what your first day was? What you ended up doing on GoldenEye?
Wow. There's a question. What was our first day? I don't actually. I'm trying to think what our first day was. I remember the first day we shot anything is we shot a test of the MiG jets that Derek Meddings had built.
Mm-hmm.
And I remember we shot a test, and he built these. I can't remember what they were like. Ridiculous. They were like £20,000 each, and they were beautifully built to scale. And we went out to shoot the test to see whether the perspective would work in relation to the runway. And then the first one took off. It took off. It banked around. It like came and just literally drove nosedive straight into the into into the runway into 1,000 pieces. And I just remember Derek saying, "Okay, so back to the drawing board," and yeah, and then he rebuilt it again. Yeah, so that was the first. I think the first time we turned over on something. God, it's really interesting. I'm going to look it up. I'm trying to think what we would have shot first. I really can't remember. Yeah, interesting. I'll have to look it up.
I just imagine in your head there would have been a second where you're like, "Oh, I'm on a Bond set now. This is serious business."
I think
Like,
so. I guess so. But I guess interestingly enough, Scott, the thing is that I was the second AD on that unit. So for me, I was very much about logistics, and I wasn't on set as the on set kind of AD. So
sure.
for me, it was a lot of paperwork, a lot of fittings, a lot of like fun. And I guess the really fun story that I always take from it, and we're still good friends now, is that when we started, Simon, I guess because we were doing the big fight sequence in the saunas, which is this. Yep. I think you have it in the States as well as in the UK. And I said to Simon, "Look, I've just been watching Gladiators. There's this woman called Eunice Huttart that's just won the UK Gladiators. Why don't I just call them and see whether she might be interested in coming to audition?" So I said, "Oh, that'd be fantastic." And we watched, we watched one of the shows, and she was a good height. She was like 5'10". Obviously super fit. She was I think she was a kickboxing champion at the time. Um, and so I called the Gladiator show on ITV, asked for the details. She didn't have an agent. So they gave me her home number because obviously I said I'm from Eon Productions. We're making a Bond film. And so they gave me her mobile number. And I remember ringing Eunice and the phone answered. And I said, "Hi, is that Eunice Hettart?" And she said, "Yeah, yeah, yeah." And I said, "My name's Richard Whelan. I'm ringing from the James Bond film GoldenEye." And she went, fuck off," and put the phone down. So I rang again, and I went, "Hi, sorry, I think we got cut off. My name's Richard Whelan. I'm on a James Bond movie called GoldenEye." And she went, "Fuck off, stop fucking about, put the phone down again." So I dial again, and I went, "Please don't put the phone down. I promise you this isn't a prank. But I'm ringing from the James Bond film. We're looking for a fighter that could come and do a fight sequence with us." Anyway, Eunice eventually came down from Liverpool with her husband. I'm convinced she thought we were all winding her up, and she came down. And Sean McCabe, who was Simon's assistant at the time, put this fight sequence together and said, "Look, I'm going to fight with you. This is what you do." Anyway, and the funny thing is like Eunice absolutely knocked the shit out of Sean. She was a phenomenal fighter, and she became the stunt double for the film. And obviously, since then, has had the most incredible career. She stayed with Simon. She then became Angelina's main stunt double on Tomb Raider, and is now, obviously an incredibly successful stunt coordinator in her own right, and now second unit director. So, so that was how Eunice's career got started as well. So it's quite crazy.
Wow. So did she end up working on the jungle sequence as well?
She did, yeah. She did all of everything that Famke did. She doubled her for, yeah. So she did that whole kind of getting dragged up into the tree, and yeah. So she did all of that, yeah, yeah.
I didn't know that my two worlds of being a Bond fan as a kid and loving gladiators had actually crossed, but apparently they have. That's
They have,
blowing my little
exactly.
mind. Oh, there you go.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Isn't that
Wow.
funny? I know, incredible, isn't it? Yeah.
Um, you mentioned something about like the role that you did, second AD on the set, and a lot of our listeners work in and around the industry. They'll know that term, but a lot don't. So, could we just sort of define maybe what your day to day was on GoldenEye in that role? What were you generally doing during production?
I guess the way the structure works is the first AD does the schedule and works out how much you're doing each day and what you're doing. He does a breakdown of requirements of all the things that are needed with extras and stunts and all the props and all of and so you end up with a schedule breakdown of everything that's needed for each day. And ultimately, the job as a second AD is to make sure that those things are all delivered. And it sounds quite straightforward, but of course, like every element is like, we need this weapon for this day. And when you have that weapon on that day, you also need a rubber version because it's going to hit someone over the head. And Martin's got to sign off on the look of the gun. Is it going to be a real gun that already exists, or are we building one from scratch, which means we need to get it carved, and there's a timeline for how long that takes. So even those kind of things take time. And then, of course, all the extras that are in it all got to be fitted, and they've all got to be made sure they've had a rehearsal for what they're doing if they need to do something that's going to be around an action sequence. And the stunt team need rehearsal time as well as being fitted, and and then they all need to travel to these different places. And so the job as a second is to make sure that you coordinate all of those elements for the first AD, so that when we do the call sheet every day, there's not things on the call sheet that are a surprise, that they've all been prepped and they're ready to go. So as the second AD, obviously you do the call sheet every day, but then you're making sure that all of those elements that are on the call sheet have been prepped, people have been fitted, they have been rehearsed, they've had a chance to see the new script pages and learn the lines, and the transport team know what time they're going to be on set and what time they're going to be in makeup, and the makeup team have had a discussion about how long it's going to take to get them ready and whether there's prosthetics. And so really my role was really making sure that all of that got done. So when we got out to all these foreign locations, it was, incredibly demanding because, we probably had like 350 extras a day at one point in Russia when we were doing the tank chase. We had 50 stunt people. they all had to be fitted. We had to do rehearsals beforehand, so I was doing rehearsal call sheets, and so it's very much a kind of administration job, but very much close connected to the first AD, to making sure that when the first AD schedule and call sheet is done, that all of the elements have been prepared for that day, basically. So that was my role.
Now, you talk about finding someone to double for Xenia Onatopp in the film. Was there any other, because in a lot of ways you're just basically problem solving. There's so many things that you could run into where you have to figure it out. Any other, curious or amusing moments where you had to figure something out and really had to kind of come up with something that was not what you necessarily expect, like the Gladiators story?
Well, I guess that was probably my biggest claim to fame at the time, was coming up with that solution. I don't think I could probably better that one in terms of day to day. I mean, the great thing about the Bonds is they are incredibly well prepared, and they are very well thought through, and they're very detailed storyboarded. And obviously now they're prevised and all, so it was really more about, for me, I think what was interesting about the Bond is because of the Broccolis and because of the way in which they've done these movies for so many years already, you kind of felt like you were sort of in a safe space, and all of the heads of department that were around that had been part of the family all really already knew how to deliver these things. So it wasn't, I guess, in the way like now, where every one of these big movies, there's different producers and different creatives, and then you're all finding your feet in relationships as well as trying to figure out the movie. At that time, Barbara, was very, very present, and always was through all of the Bonds after that. And so you felt so well supported that it was probably the most well prepared and efficient movie that I probably had done as a second AD, I think, and probably since. I think because of that reason, because there was repeat business, everybody had worked together, everyone knew each other's strengths. And I think the only tricky part of it was sort of what I said earlier. There was a few new guys that came into the movie, including Martin, and who Martin brought in. And I think even Simon Crane at the time, Simon had taken over from, I think, Paul Weston. And Simon was a very young coordinator at the time and was quite new. And so he was pushing the envelope. And so I think it was just that it was a good time of strong existing producers that knew how to produce and prep a James Bond film, bringing in sort of maverick, fresh ideas from Martin and Simon and Phil Mayhew, the DP, and so I think all of those elements came together to make it a very efficient kind of experience, I think.
Which is, it's interesting because part of, as Cam alluded to, is problem solving is what you're doing, and you would think in an abstract way, being on a production like a Bond film, there's a lot more money. You can just do stuff a lot easier. But if anything, it would present bigger options, bigger problems to overcome because the scale of everything is pushed so much larger. You talk about like the dam, no one else is doing that, so you're having to problem solve something of that scale. It's huge. I want to get into sort of the cast and crew and things that you've interacted with during your journey with GoldenEye. Now, I know with the second unit, typically it's a lot of the action and sets and things and like going to locations. Did you get to work at any point with the main cast of Pierce, anyone like that? Were you shooting scenes with them, or were you around them at the time? Or did you get a sense of Pierce specifically and then other cast?
Yeah, I did. Yeah, no, because what would happen is that as a second unit we would set up. So like the tank chase is a classic example. All of the footage with Piers in the tank steering the tank. The second unit shot that, and Piers just came over from main unit. So it was worked out that Martin would be shooting something, whether it be with them or with Femke, and or with the rest of the team that were in the Russian kind of center. and then he would just literally run over and sort of like just give notes on what we'd shot. So Piers came and did all of the tank chase with us in the studio part of it. So all of his coverage we shot, and then the same in the Arecibo dish out in Puerto Rico. Piers flew out to shoot that with us with second, and just did that with second unit. So we did those two sequences with Piers, and then we did the jungle, like Famke's death. We did as a second unit, so we did the coverage on Famke being wedged in the tree dead. So there was a really interesting kind of overlap between the two units. Is like if it made sense just to send the principal cast to second unit to do those pieces, then they did it, and it was all sort of pre-planned. It wasn't just like last minute. It was like a specific decision that Martin was happy for either Ian to shoot certain elements of it. If it was just action, say like Piers like steering the tank, there was no emotional performance there. So Martin was very happy for Ian to direct those things. When we did the fight in the sauna, that was a bit of a combination. So we did the fight with the doubles to sort of set the whole action up, and then Martin came in and shot the sort of the A side of like Piers fighting with Eunice, the double, or then Famke fighting with Wayne Michaels, Piers's double. And so so it was a bit of a combination. And then the same thing on the Ferrari Aston chase, where both Famke and Piers came to us, and that we shot some rig stuff with them driving during that piece.
And if I remember correctly, didn't one of the cars have a bit of a trouble during that sequence? I think one of the cars had a bit of an issue.
No, we crashed two cars into each other.
That was it.
So the story is, which is quite another fun story, is that we wanted two at the time. We wanted two Ferraris and two Astons. We built the Astons out of old Astons and then did them all up. So the Astons were fine, and they had we put different engines in them, and so that was all fine. But the Ferraris, we had we had one Ferrari, and Ferrari didn't want to give us a second one. And eventually, I think a week out from shooting, they agreed to give us a second one. But unbeknownst to us on the second unit, the producers had agreed that the second one only be used like parked up, or like we knew we had two more cars, but we knew we only had two more cars. So I just remember they had given us a Ferrari engineer to be with us for the duration of the shoot, who didn't speak any English. And I remember like he sees this car, and the Ferrari, like the whole front end was like mangled. And my boss, Terry, at 4:00 in the afternoon, pulls this guy over, gets the translator, and basically says, right, this is your job. You've got to take this car, take it to your main repair shop, get the whole front end repaired, and be back here for 5:30 tomorrow morning for when we turn over. And you could see this guy's face thinking, this is ridiculous. It's never going to happen. And so we're saying, this is not a question. You have to do it. So this poor guy like puts this broken Ferrari on his transporter, drives it all the way to, I don't remember where he had to drive it to, but it was a long drive, gets all of the repair team in overnight, and they literally rebuild the front end of this Ferrari. Our car team, which were Bickers, rebuilt the Aston. Anyway, so this poor guy has driven 5 hours, worked through the night, driven this car back the next morning. We'd had the Aston repaired. He came back looking like death, obviously, because he'd just been like with an inch of his life of sleep. And literally, the moment he landed, 5 inches of snow hit the mountain. And so this poor guy arrives, it's like he turned up, like It's here. It's here. The car is here. And we're like, we ain't shooting, buddy, because like it's all snow. And he's like, you're not filming? You're not filming? What? And we literally sat there for 3 days in solid snow. And the whole, like, the schedule was completely blown out the window. And this poor guy, to this day, you kind of wonder if he could process like what had happened, because we were so like, if you're not here, we will have you fired. Like it was like our lives depended on it. And then we literally sat around for 3 days doing nothing. Yeah, it was crazy. But yeah, so that was a fun story.
At least he had 3 days to catch up on his sleep, I suppose.
That's true. Silver linings, exactly.
Yeah.
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 Well, what did
go
it
on,
feel
Ken.
like after all this, all these crazy experiences making the film? What does it feel like to actually see the movie in finished form?
It's fabulous because I just look back on, it was such a, it was a huge privilege for me to be asked to do a Bond film. And it was early in my career as a second AD. So um there were so many reasons why it was such a great experience for me and a great privilege to have been asked to do that film. And just a series of lucky meetings got me to meet Terry, work with Terry. Terry asked me to do that movie. And so, I every time I watch the film, I just absolutely love, like, there are so many stories from so many different aspects of the shooting of it. And they're all, some of them are crazy. This, I'm sure this is not something for a podcast, but like, we were told, we had these very, very strict memos come out when we went to St. Petersburg. We were staying in the Hermitage Hotel, and we had these very strict memos saying, there are a lot of high class hookers in this hotel. You cannot go with them because they carry Rohypnol and they'll knock you out, steal everything. And, it's very serious, and they'll lose your passport and your money. And so do not, meet any of these, ladies of the night and spend the evening. And of course, cut to one of our, it will remain nameless, obviously, one of our Brips, one evening comes running into the foyer, and he was a big lad, running into the foyer with a towel saying, I've been robbed, I've been robbed, I've been robbed. and and Barbara Broccoli was so cross with him. And because we had like 90 police with us every day, she got the commissioner of police to come and arrest him the next night. And basically, they came and arrested him, put him in the police car, drove him round St. Petersburg for an hour, drove him back to the hotel, and Barbara had arranged for all of the crew to be in the foyer. So when the police drop him back in the foyer, we all just gave him a huge round of applause as he came back in the foyer. So yeah, anyway, but that's probably not a story for a podcast. But it was like a perfect way. I think he never did it again, I'm sure. Basically, yeah,
Not that he would admit to, anyway.
not what he would admit to. Exactly. Yeah. Yeah, no, it was so all of those things. There was so many fond memories of it, and and how we did every sequence. It was so well prepped, so well planned. I say, just the privilege of driving Ferraris at ridiculous speeds. Christoph, who drove the Ferrari, drove the Aston, was this incredible rally driver. The quality of those guys and the quality of the stunt team, and the quality of, for Phil Mayhew as the cinematographer on the main unit, again, he had, it was a huge thing for him to do. And so there was an amazing energy of new filmmakers that were wanting to make their mark, and wise filmmakers that have made their mark that helped guide. So the stars kind of aligned on that movie, I think. We did every trick in the book, as I said to you. The shot of the plane going down the runway before it goes off the cliff in the big, huge, wide vista. Derek Meddings painted this beautiful foreground glass painting up on the top of the watchtower that's still at Leavesden now, and painted it so that there was exact camera position that meant that we ran the plane down the runway at Leavesden, and it looked like it was in the middle of the Alps. And it was an old methodology done on what was at the time a very contemporary movie. And the amount of models that Derek built, he built the Tigra helicopter. As I say, he built the MiGs, the shot of all the MiGs lined up on the runway. Those MiGs were all painted cardboard cutouts that the art department had painted because we couldn't get that many MiGs on a runway, even the Bond film. The ship that we had docked in harbour down in Monaco was a deal that Tom Pevsner did to have this incredibly kind of high-tech ship stay in dock overnight for one more day so that we could then film on it with Piers and the crew. Those kind of things and those kind of doors that being part of Eon and being part of a Bond that get opened and still get opened now. I think even the last few Bonds, it's the same thing. Those calls, and Barbara's so well respected and Michael's so well respected that they open a lot of doors with all of the armed forces and the military and the CIA and MI6, and they're all very supportive of Eon as a company. So you get a lot of doors open that you would never normally have.
Mm-hmm. One thing we've been talking about with people who've come on the show to talk about GoldenEye, with the interviews we've been doing for the film, is to just, and I'll probably use this as my last question for GoldenEye, move us on, is not so much about the impact of the film to the people who went to see it. What impact did GoldenEye have to you as someone who worked on it?
Well, I think for anybody that worked on it, and I'm sure all the other people will say the same, is like, when you've done a Bond film, it does put you on a career trajectory which is probably quite different to where it may well have been otherwise. It opens a lot of doors. Terry and I went on to work together, and interestingly, because obviously, after GoldenEye there was a bit of a gap, and then incredibly for me, and I was incredibly fortunate by it, is that as a result of GoldenEye and my sort of, I guess there was a couple of fortunate things. Basically, I did GoldenEye. I then got asked to do a movie called Fever Pitch with Colin Firth and Mark Strong as a second AD, and the first AD that was doing the movie, bizarrely, I actually said, "Look, will you go in and start scheduling with the director? I've got a ski holiday booked, and then I'll come back, finish off the schedule, and then we'll start shooting." Fever Pitch was a tiny, low budget movie, and the first AD phoned me on the second week to say that she'd broken her leg and wasn't going to be able to do the movie. So I went into the producers and said, "Look, Davina's broken her leg. So I totally understand if you need to find a new team. I'll step away." And the producer said, "Look, why don't you stay in first the movie?" So I started first in very young in my career. So I was 26 at the time, I think. So, and I think if I hadn't done GoldenEye and I didn't have those kind of credits, I probably wouldn't have been trusted to make that move early. So I think it probably was very, very poignant that having done that kind of scale of film, that probably my career trajectory was probably very different as a result of it. So I guess that's probably the biggest thing I take from it. And I guess the if there was a negative, and it wasn't really a negative, but what made a difference was that because I then became a first assistant director at that point, Terry Madden went on to do every one of those films as a second year first AD, right the way up until recently. And the first ADs on the main unit, again, Jerry Gavigan went on to do many more of those films. There wasn't really a place for me in the Eon family because there's only two first ADs, the second unit one and the main unit one. So I guess there wasn't an opportunity for me to do another Bond, which I guess to a degree I regret. But I had a great career, so it was just a different path. But but I suppose it did set me on the path of being a first AD much earlier in my career than I expected.
And you also wound up on a great Bond movie to be on. If you only do one in your career, I mean, you can't really go wrong with GoldenEye.
You can't, no. Although I would have loved to have done Casino Royale because I think
Sure.
Martin has reinvented the Bonds twice so incredibly successfully, and I think that was for me, of the new generation of Bonds, I think that definitely stands out. I think as well.
Oh yeah, yeah.
Well, I want to cast the net a little wider now, and firstly take us back a couple of years to 1992, and that is Patriot Games.
Yes.
Not exactly the Bond production. It's a bit of a different beast, but it's coming off the back of The Hunt for Red October, which was a big
Yeah.
hit. A lot of people liked that film. They'd had the change of actor, Harrison Ford stepping into the role, change of director with Phyllis Noyce coming aboard. How did you get connected with Patriot Games, and sort of what sort of stands out about you when you think about the film?
So I had done a little movie. I'd been asked to go and do a little movie for with Peter Yates called Year of the Comet as a second AD on the second unit. And again, I think the first AD left, and then I ended up taking over the second unit for a bit. And Nigel Wool was the line producer on it, and Nigel had then gone on to do Patriot Games. And so Nigel phoned me to say, look, got this movie with, that we need a floor AD to work with the American first, a guy called Dennis McGuire. Do you want to come and do it? And I said, at that point, the name of the game is you get offered a job, you say yes. So I said, yeah, sure. So it was a very much an English team working for a very sort of top line group of producers, director, first AD, DP, etc. And so that's how I got involved. And then it was really interesting because we were all doing the movie. Philip Noyce was quite a sort of relatively new filmmaker at the time, and I remember talking to the first AD, and the first AD's basically saying, "This movie is going to be the biggest piece of shit ever. It's complete garbage. No one knows what they're doing. It's going to be a catastrophe." And so we went through the whole movie thinking it was going to be shit. And and we did some great stuff on it, and it was a very political film.
Mm-hmm.
I think Harrison was going through a point where he wasn't really sure whether the character that he was playing in Patriot Games was ever going to work. So I think he had a lot of tense moments with Philip. Philip was quite an unusual style of director, very laid back. And we were, we had very complex schedule, shooting in difficult locations in London, and plus we had to go abroad. So it wasn't a happy shoot. And as I say, I just remember even the first AD, where you're supposed to sort of be completely loyal to the film, was just constantly saying, "I don't know what we're doing. This is garbage. It's never going to get released." And how wrong one could be.
I was gonna say,
So
yeah. I mean, it
yeah,
spawns a sequel with them
exactly. Yeah.
reuniting and
A franchise. Yeah.
Mm.
yeah. And have you worked on anything else in your career where it was a similar thing? Like, was that unique? That sense of like this movie's not working at all, and then it turns into something that people really enjoy.
Um, I suppose to a degree, in a way, I think probably With Nail and I was another one
Mm.
because it was so mad.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, it was, everybody was doing drugs who was making the movie. So like nobody really knew what was going on. And it was just bonkers. And I was like, I was talking to someone the other day, and I remember like going into interview for the film, and the producer said to me, you've got two important jobs on this film. And I said, "Oh, that's great. What are they?" She said, "One, to make sure there's 200 cigarettes always available for the production coordinator because she smokes 60 a day. And two, to make sure that the Smirnoff Red Label vodka is ice cold when I get in at 10 o'clock in the morning." And he kind of, yeah, no, sure, sure. And he was absolutely right. That was the thing. And if he got in at 10 o'clock in the morning, he'd start drinking. And if the vodka wasn't cold, I'd get a bollocking. And so it was completely mad. And he just thought, what am I doing? And then, the legendary story, I had to buy all the alcohol for Paul and Richard to go into the boardroom at Shepperton. And, and the directive was, you guys finish this bottle of vodka each, and then I'll come and rehearse the scene. And what nobody knew is that Richard had an allergy to alcohol. And so he projectile vomited all over the boardroom table, went unconscious. We called an ambulance, rushed him to hospital. And I think he never touched a drop of alcohol again after that. So it was so bonkers that we all thought we were just working on something. You know, Ray Cooper was our producer, you know, Elton John's drummer, who's the maddest lunatic you'll ever meet. So it was just such a crazy movie that I just thought, like, what am I doing? Like, what, this cannot be anything of any substance. And, you know, of course, the irony of it is that whoever I meet, you know, I had to meet Baz Luhrmann a few years ago to do a movie with him. And the first movie he said is like, I can't believe you did Windell and I. And it was like a tiny £2.5 million handmade films movie. But yeah, it's amazing how many people reference it whenever they look at, you know, my body of work. It's quite funny.
Well, it's a British cult classic. Like
it really is. Yeah.
Criterion Collection.
I didn't even know it was on the Criterion. Wow.
Yeah, it is. Yeah.
There you go.
Yeah, it must be. Yeah.
Well, okay. So I mean, I wasn't expecting that twist with Patriot Games, but it is a spy movie podcast, so it wouldn't be right if there wasn't at least one twist in here. So that's fine. Was there a moment during the production where sort of the penny dropped? Do you recall where you're like, oh, this actually might be something good, or was it really like once it came out and it was well received?
No, it was literally once. I mean, we all finished, you know, thinking that was, you know, it was. We weren't even sure that it was going to get released.
Wow.
We were all thinking, are they ever going to release this film? And like everyone thought it was just such a turkey. It's weird. I don't know why that was. Yeah. I think also like Harrison is. Yeah. I don't think they even had one.
Oh my God.
I mean, I literally like the UK team. And I think oddly, you know, Harrison is so, and obviously I've worked with him since and we've talked about it and we laughed about it, is that Harrison is so understated in every way, both on the set, off the set. You know, he's one of those stars that you barely know is there. And I think it was almost like the understated performance that he did in that movie as an outsider on the set watching it. It wasn't like, and now here is the star doing his scene. It was all so low key. And I think Philip was very low key. He wasn't a big shouter and yeller. So the set was really quiet. And I think in a strange way, it all seemed like very underwhelming. And I think maybe that was why it felt like what it was. And there was no big small talk. There was no real, sort of communication with the crew. You know, we were a UK crew working for an American team, and we were there literally to provide a service, and that was it. So we were slightly detached from the real creative conversations about the film. So I think all of those things just led to the fact of all of us thinking, like, what are we doing here, kind of thing. And we just come off of doing, Year of the Comet with Peter Yates. That the movie was a disaster, but Peter's an incredibly collaborative director, and he was like, we were all in awe of him. He directed Bullet, and and that obviously turned out to be a total disaster. But so I suppose we'd come off of that as a team, and we all felt like this is really underwhelming. So it was probably the biggest surprise, I think, of my career, that it was the success that it was.
Wow. Well, geez, one movie that was a big success, and you probably knew it was going to be something of a success going in, was Captain America: The First Avenger.
Yeah.
I would love to know just the experience of working at Marvel Studios at a time where they aren't quite Marvel Studios all in caps, because like you've had Iron Man, which is a big hit, but this is before the Disney acquisition. This is before the big days of the Avengers. What was it like working within Marvel at that point?
It was absolutely phenomenal, because at that point it was really, it was very much, it was Kevin, Luis Desposito, and Victoria Alonso, who I know is no longer there. They were the powerhouse behind everything that was Marvel at the time. And, Kevin, as still he is now, was incredibly hands-on. Luis was very hands-on. Victoria ran all of post. And, they were collaborators with us, and they were incredibly supportive. They loved Joe. They loved what he wanted to do with the movie. They loved creatively how he took it with Rick. Ryan Meanderling at the time was really interesting because Ryan really is their secret weapon. But at the time, he was flown over as a concept guy, and I think we never gave him the respect that he deserved at that time on that movie because we just thought he's a concept guy. He's going to draw some concepts, he'll go, and no one will ever see him again. How wrong that that could be. So I think it was really I felt really honoured to be sort of part of it at that time. An interesting Callum, my partner I mentioned before, he's doing the two Avengers movies back to back at the moment with the Russos, and and we were laughing because obviously like where it is now from where it was when I did Captain America is like two different companies. Although I think what's really beautiful about it is that Kevin's hands-on approach to their movies is what gives them the success that they have, is that that little nucleus of Lewis and Kevin is there's still the drive behind the brand even now, and I think that's a huge credit to both of them. I think because they've managed to sort of keep that drive that there's always they are the creative control of those movies, and they make sure that they hit certain standards, and I think that's huge credit to them. I think
one of the things I always think about with Captain America: The First Avenger is getting Joe Johnston aboard, because I think that was probably the smartest thing they could have done. Because the whole idea of Captain America is earnestness. That's all I think about when I think about the character. I mean, and I go back to I think of The Rocketeer with Joe Johnston. Like it's one of my favorite films. Great film. And this, for me, a little bit is like a do-over of that film in many ways. What was that like working with Joe? Did you get much time with him as AD? And also, this is the first one we've spoken about where you're doing first AD work of the films we've talked about as well. So different role you're doing on the set. But what was that set like, and what was Joe Johnston like?
Well, Captain America was fantastic because Joe and I had already forged a relationship because Joe came and took over on the Wolfman that I'd done as well, which obviously would turned out to be a dreadful movie, but we first collaborated. So the first director had been fired. We had 3 weeks left of prep to go. Joe was flown in, so we were thrown together. He had the choice of replacing me and getting someone else. He chose not to. We got on amazingly. It was an incredibly difficult movie to make. And so we'd been through fire together already. And so we went straight from that to do Captain America. And, and we came as a package because Joe brought us ultimately. So, Shelley was the DP on Wolfman. Shelley came and did Captain America. Rick Heinrichs was the designer on Wolfman, came and did Captain America. Myself, the line producer, Nigel Costello. So we all sort of moved from the Wolfman, of which was a very difficult experience, into doing Captain America. So we all already had a real shorthand, and I think that made an enormous difference to how smoothly the production went. And and I think between Rick and Joe's incredible creative ideas, I think Kevin and Lewis couldn't have chosen better because like Joe was very hands-on with the design of the suit and the bikes and the Hydra soldiers, and obviously the cars, and so he had a big sort of input into all of that, and he designed a lot of the end title sequence, and he's such a force as a designer as well as a director. And it was kind of lovely because his style of directing is very minimalistic. So he gave the cast a lot of freedom. Hugo Weaving is an incredibly tough actor, and it was a very demanding role for him, but he absolutely loved it because him and Joe had such a great relationship, and we'd all worked together on the Wolfman as well. So Hugo came from the Wolfman. So I think it was the stars really aligned with that. I think the only thing that was, I think was kind of pressured and challenging. Well, there was two big things that were pressured and challenging. One was his suit. That was a long and difficult road. They had fired the original costume designer that we'd brought on board that was that Joe liked and respected really well. But they felt like every design he was doing was like Captain America the musical. It was all too colourful and too flamboyant, and so that was very pressured. But I think that ended up becoming a fabulous bit of design. So that was challenging, and then the Hydra soldiers was really challenging. So the design of those things, and again, Ryan had obviously an enormous part to play in all of that. But I think it's really interesting, and I'm sure if you talk to Ryan about that, any of those things now, is that what was always an interesting process is that Ryan's amazing design work ultimately, when you try and build the version of that he's drawn, inevitably it just doesn't work because the three-dimensional version of what amazing designs Ryan's done, there's too many complications that go with it that prevent you from putting the fold where it is, or the stitching where it is, or the boot at that height, or the collar in that style, or with the Hydra soldiers, the helmets like that, or so. I think what we learnt very quickly on Captain America is like Ryan did the designs, and let's just make a prototype now. And then you learnt an awful lot, and then he would redraw the concept, having seen the prototype, to figure out how to make it better. And so I think that all of that was a big learning curve, but a really pleasurable one. And I have nothing but really tremendous memories from everything on that movie. The stars aligned and everything just really worked well, I think.
For my money, like that costume is one of the best adaptations of a comic book
I think so.
outfit. Because when you look at some of the ones that were also home runs, you look at like Batman's suit, and say like Wolverine, which you saw in Deadpool, 3 recently.
Yeah.
There's something about those that they are inherently cool just to look at on the page. And so if you can kind of crack it in a movie, it'll work. But Captain America's one where you look at that on the page and go, there's no way any human being could wear this and come across as
Exactly.
serious in
Yes.
live action. It's just,
Yeah.
it's too ridiculous in terms of being a
Yeah.
live action thing. And I remember thinking that going into, they announced Iron Man and Thor and Captain America. And in my head, it was like, this is impossible. And at the very least, they get away with not embarrassing. And when
Yeah.
I saw the pictures, it actually looked really cool, which
Yeah.
I
Yeah.
honestly thought was an impossible thing to do going in.
No, I totally agree. And I remember, I think the one thing that took us the most time was to try and figure out the helmet so that it looked cool. And I think the biggest success of it was the fact that it was Second World War. I think also was, I think helped enormously. I think the setting helped enormously. But I remember the nightmares for Chris with the with the with the helmet of just the agony of the various tests they did of trying to find one that worked and that he could wear, he could do action with, and yeah, I remember that was a real journey. But I think all those things always are. I think I'm sure even now they still have the same problems.
Mm-hmm.
Now, I'm conscious of the time. I'm conscious of how long we've kept you. I know Cam had a quick question about Star Wars that he felt burning need to ask.
Yes, you mentioned it earlier, Attack of the Clones. You're credited
Yeah.
with additional scenes on Star
Yes.
Wars. What was the job on Star Wars specifically?
It was really good because what George did at the time when he made those movies is that he set a mantra that principal photography would be 60 days long,
Mm-hmm.
and that's all it would be. But he budgeted with Rick a further 30 days of shooting after he'd cut the movie. So Chris Newman that I did a show called Band of Brothers with. Chris and I like split the units between us. I did 5 episodes and Chris did 5. Chris did the original shoot of Attack of the Clones, so he really did the movie, but he couldn't do the additional photography with George, and so he suggested that I do it, because we were good friends. And so I went in and did the 30 days of additional photography with George that then, they basically recut and changed the movie and did various different, but, obviously George's thing was like, we would do, which even by today's standards is pretty amazing, but he would do like 40 to 50 setups a day.
Wow.
And so what we did in 30 days was almost, reshoot probably over half the movie, because he just worked so fast. And I mean, so much so, I think even the actors weren't sure what they were doing, because we moved so quickly. George would sort of say, like, just walk down that green screen and turn right on there. You're going to see this person. You want to react as a shock and then exit. And they're like, yeah, but what part? Don't worry, just do it. And they would do it, and it would be part of the scene. And so it was. He had it all in his head, and the artistry was extraordinary. Yeah. But he certainly could shoot fast.
A little bit in some ways like someone like James Cameron, who has a sense of what they want and are working at basically the biggest scale possible.
I think so. I think all of those, I've been really lucky. I say Joe Johnston, the same. Joe's got a very clear image of what he wants and knows how to get it in so many clever filmmaking trickery ways that you kind of really love to see when they work. And I think George is the same, Jim was the same. Yeah, I've been really very lucky through all my career to work with pretty extraordinary directors. So yeah, and they all have that kind of gift of just a really strong vision of the movie and a really sort of clear line of like, this is how we're going to get to it. And I think that's how those movies end up being the best they can be.
Mm-hmm.
A few questions then to wrap us up. And one you briefly spoke about earlier that I wanted to ask about, which is more about the future than talking about things you've already worked on. And that is, I saw a little note that you're producing a remake, a reboot, a reimagining of The Professionals, which is, of course, the 1970s to 80s kind of cop/spy TV show. ITV, I believe it played on year in the UK. I've seen it on Gold, I think, since. But yeah, like what I only had learned that this was happening from doing our research today. Where is that sitting in its production, and how much spy stuff can we expect?
So we've gone through a number of versions of it, and in a number of different guises. Callum and I have had the option to do this movie, I think, for nearly probably 8 years now. And it's gone through various different versions. And as I say, Martin Campbell's attached to do this version of it. And interestingly, this version, we really love it, but it's loosely based on the book about the Texaco oil story called Crude, which was all to do with Texaco's kind of raping of the Nigerian jungle in order to put pipelines through. And so we based it loosely on that because we wanted to make the show international. We wanted to make it I guess the exciting thing about it is that this is the kind of the evolution and the start of CI5. So this movie basically halfway through is the birth of CI5 and why they exist. So that's the fundamental jump off point for this movie. And really, we're at a point where Martin is talking to cast, and we're really desperately trying to put the threesome together, as it were. So that's where we're at the moment.
That's always the daunting task, isn't it? When you're trying to bring something back like that, who do you put in those roles that are beloved by people? That's it. Is it young people? Yeah. Is it like, because if you're trying to reimagine it from the ground up, I imagine you're going a bit younger.
Yeah, a bit younger, and not much younger than the original. The guys are going to be like mid to late 20s.
Mm-hmm.
And I think, we've also been under pressure over the last few years of just changing up. Let's make Cowley a woman, and let's make Doyle a woman, and and that's all great, and I think we're totally open to it. Although we feel with this movie that actually it's just better to let's just pay homage to the original and leave it as it is, and not change that for this particular franchise, and let's just make the show that reflects the original. So I think we'll probably stick with it being very much three guys, and I think there's lots of good things that can come out of that. I think there's lots of good messages to guys around the world in terms of friendship and relationships and structure of work and work ethic and all of those things that I think guys now are living with in the 21st century of being a man, that we can put into this movie without it just being a movie for blokes only. So that's the hope. Well, we'll see.
And then on the side of that, we've got that to one side you're working on. What else have you got in the pipeline at the moment?
So I'm just co-producing a show, which is the second season of a show called The Agency with Michael Fassbender and Richard Gere and and it's fabulous. It's 101 Studios for Paramount. The first season was hugely successful. It's based on a French show called La Bureau. And we're just literally wrapping up on season 2 in the next couple of weeks. So it's in post, and I'm not sure exactly when it releases, but I think it releases pretty soon.
Were you involved in the first season, or have you come on board for the second?
I was. No, I was. Yeah, I set up the first season structurally in terms of a production plan for the first season. And then I had another movie that I was going to do. So I left to do another movie. That movie, like all of these independent films, didn't happen. And so I came back. I did some of the difficult locations in Estonia that they shot. And then, then I came back, and then I've been on the whole of season 2. So yeah, it's been good.
Yeah, I didn't jump out on your credits, otherwise I would have mentioned it. But it's a pretty the first season was very well liked by spy movie fans, spy TV fans. So it's a spy show. So yeah, the second season, that's something to look forward to there. Jeffrey Wright.
You interestingly didn't. Yeah, he is. Yeah, Jeffrey's in it. Yeah, he's phenomenal. Yeah. I do love because you haven't mentioned Citadel, Scott.
I was curious about Citadel.
Which was supposed to be the ultimate spy show.
Well, if you want to talk about it for a second, we'll have that conversation. It's what I found interesting about is the lens in which Citadel came out was this whole idea of it's going to be this multi-season, multi-series, TV, film, radio, books. It was everything. It was going to be the whole kit and caboodle, and then it's just been the one season. And I think it had one spin-off show for another season as well.
I think it did. I think they did either an Italian or a Mexican spin-off, I think.
Yeah. That was it, and it just sort of fell off a little bit, and I don't know whether because it did sort of coincide because it's an Amazon production, so I wonder if the Bond rights coming in had a little bit to say with that. But
I would imagine so because they have shot a second season.
Okay,
but I don't know what's happened to it because it was shot quite some time ago.
I was going to say because the first season was 2022, I think, and it came out.
Well, yeah, because it got caught up. I mean, I think a couple of things were unfortunate about it. I think one, we got caught up in COVID, so we were making a very different show when I first started it, and the whole drive of it is like we're going to make a brand new Mission Impossible scale, enormous, kind of international project, and we were going to 5 countries when I first started the prep on it. Then we got hit by COVID, and then it was like we can't go anywhere. So, so that was really challenging for a start. So we had to build America in the UK, and we eventually went to Spain for a couple of weeks, and that was about it. We sent the second unit off. The second unit shot. So Simon Crane shot the second unit on the first season, and Simon shot an opening sequence which never will see the light of day, which was a 10-minute ski sequence that went from the top of a mountain, paragliding down halfway down the mountain, dropping off, skiing through a whole ski sequence with being chased by Can-Ams with tracks, and then motorbikes with studs, and then skiing from snow to then skiing on no snow through a forest, and eventually ending up in a big fight sequence at the bottom of the mountain. And that will never see the light of day. And that was all shot in Slovenia. So that was the original opening to the show that I was involved in. And then I think they reshot a completely different opening that all took place with a fight on a train between Priyanka and Richard and a load of bad guys. So yeah, so the show that was released, I mean, I watched the show that was released. We did 7 1-hour episodes, and I think they released 6 35-minute episodes.
Yeah.
And I think I did a count, and I think there was about 20 minutes of the original show that I shot that actually existed in the final released version. So yeah, it got heavily reshot for all sorts of reasons.
Well, okay. Well, that was my follow up. So was it, you shot an original version with your team, and then was it handed over for like a, you know, they did a round of editing and thought, no, we need to shoot a few more things, do some reshoots, and ended up just basically recompiling the whole show?
Pretty much, yeah.
Wow. Okay.
Yeah, I think that's the probably that's the narrative that I think we can all discuss on a podcast.
Okay.
It was probably slightly more complex and political than that, but yes. Basically,
we'll soon
yes.
to be going off the air. We can have that conversation there, and we can. It won't be divulged to other people. Okay. Well, I'm glad we talked about it and we've addressed it. So that was the Citadel in the room.
Exactly. Totally. Yeah. Yeah.
Well, that leaves me with one final duty and one final question, and this question has been asked to everyone that's worked. Everyone that's been on our show, every interview has had this question, including people that worked on GoldenEye, like Bruce Firestein, have been on here and spoken about it.
Fantastic. Yeah.
Great guy. And Jeff Kane as well, we've had him on.
Oh, great.
But we talk about spy movies, not just James Bond here on the show. We love spy movies. It's our thing. So, Richard, I'm putting you in the hot seat now. I told you I'd be surprising you with a question. Here it is. We need to know, what is your favorite spy movie of all time?
Wow. What a question. What a question. God, that's a really interesting question. And I don't think it definitely isn't a spy movie, but because obviously for me, like I think in terms of a really suspenseful film, is that, you know, All the President's Men was probably my favorite of kind of suspense movies that I've watched in terms of that. But in terms of spy movies, wow. You know, I don't even have a good answer for that.
Well,
I mean, I think certainly my favorite Bond movie, and I suppose it could easily be my favorite spy movie, is absolutely Live and Let Die by far.
Okay, what is it about that one?
I think about what I loved about that one is, and it's always controversial because so many people don't like Live and Let Die as Bond movies go, but I think what I loved about it was that it was phenomenal action. It was a story that made sense, but also it had some of the best humor in it that was sort of came out of all of the action, and it felt crafted in a way that it worked. And I think it's always quite hard on Bonds, and that's why I think they've always gone in the direction since, you know, in the latter, you know, Daniel Craig movies, where, you know, they've just been more real and more serious and less humor in them. And I just felt like Live and Let Die really worked, even if it was, you know, bit tongue in cheek at times. I just felt it worked, and I just think that boat sequence for me stands out as one of the greatest Bond action sequences of all time.
And you look at when they tried to replicate that formula with the next one, Man with the Golden Gun, and you see that, like, there was something within Live and Let Die that was special because it's not something that's as easy to do that second time.
I think, I totally agree. I think you're right. Yeah, because it wasn't as good a movie. I think, I don't know. I think the stars aligned, and I think I felt like with Live and Let Die, I believed the villains more than I did after that, and I think that's probably what held it together as a movie. You know, however crazy some of the things were in it, you know, and, you know, the 7-foot voodoo guy and even though they were crazy, you still believe they could exist. And I suppose that's what I loved about that movie.
It's a great
So I
pick.
suppose that
Yeah.
and the very first Mission Impossible movie probably are the two that I would definitely put up there very high. I think Brian De Palma's a genius. And I thought what he did with that franchise at that point, that I just truly believe has never been repeated. I think was phenomenal.
You went in saying you couldn't think of anything, and you came out with two very good answers. So I don't think we can
Okay.
complain. I think Live and Let Die and Mission Impossible, a great combo, a great two movies to watch back to back. Why not?
I think so. I think absolutely you can
Yeah.
watch them time and time again. Yeah.
Absolutely. Well, I'm aware of the hour, and I want to thank you for taking the time to sit down with us. You've given us more than I could have ever dreamed of. I hope the listeners have enjoyed it. I hope you've had a good time.
I had a great time. It's been so interesting going back over those memories. I probably should have been more prepared, but it was it's been really lovely to talk to you both, and such great questions, and really appreciate your enthusiasm.
Thank you very much, Richard.